Elvis Presley was known for his generosity. Cars, jewelry, houses, stories people loved to repeat. But there was one act of kindness that never became a headline, never became a rumor, never even became a story. It happened quietly, after midnight, involving a man Elvis had never met, and a funeral no one else was willing to pay for. Why did Elvis Presley step in? And why did he make sure no one ever knew? Stay with us until the end, because this story reveals a side of Elvis that existed far from the spotlight and closer to guilt than generosity. The call came late, not urgent, not dramatic, just uncomfortable. Elvis was sitting alone in his room, lights low, television playing without sound. He hadn't been watching it, just letting the noise fill the silence he didn't want to sit with. When the phone rang, he almost didn't answer. Almost. "This is Elvis," he said, voice calm, practiced. The man on the other end hesitated. "Mr. Presley, I don't really know how to say this." Elvis closed his eyes. He knew that tone. People only use it when they were about to ask for something, or admit they already had. "You can say it," Elvis replied. The man introduced himself as a local funeral director. His voice was polite, restrained, like someone walking carefully across thin ice. "There's been a situation," the man said. "A death. The family." "Well, there is no family." Elvis listened, silent. "The deceased listed your name," the man continued. "Not as a relative, just a contact, someone he admired." That got Elvis's attention. "He attended one of your shows years ago," the man explained. Apparently it meant a great deal to him. Elvis felt something tighten in his chest. The director cleared his throat. "There are no funds, no arrangements, no one to claim the body." A pause. "I'm calling because I didn't know who else would care." Elvis looked down at the carpet, jaw set. "What's his name?" he asked. The director said it. Elvis repeated it quietly to himself, not because he recognized it, but because it felt wrong to let it pass unheard. "How much?" Elvis asked. There was surprise on the other end. "Sir, how much does it take to put a man in the ground with dignity?" Elvis said. The director hesitated. "We're not asking you to." "I know," Elvis interrupted gently. "I'm a skin." The number was modest, embarrassingly so. Elvis didn't react. "Take care of it," he said. "Don't put my name anywhere." "Mr. Presley." "Promise me," Elvis said, firmer now. "No name, no mention." The director swallowed. "Yes, sir." When the call ended, the room felt quieter than before. Elvis sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. He didn't feel generous. He felt responsible. Because somewhere along the way, Elvis Presley had learned something heavy. When people felt seen by him, even once, they sometimes carried that moment for the rest of their lives. And tonight, one of them had died alone. Elvis didn't sleep that night. He lay on top of bed, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling as if it might offer an explanation that felt cleaner than the truth forming in his chest. He kept hearing the funeral director's voice. "There is no family, no one to claim the body." The word sat heavy, refusing to fade. Elvis haughty to tell himself he'd done a good thing, that it was kindness, that it was generosity, the kind people already associated with his name. But that wasn't what it felt like. It felt like something overdue. He thought back to the shows, the crowds blurring together, the faces he never remembered because there were simply too many of them. He had waved, smiled, touched hands, nodded, said, "Thank you," until the gestures became instinct instead of intention. To him, they were moments. To someone else, they were anchors. He sat up and rubbed his face slowly. "How many people think they know me?" he muttered. "When I don't even know their names." The man on the phone had admired him, had written his name down as an emergency contact. Not because Elvis had promised anything, but because in that man's mind, Elvis represented something safe, something meaningful. That realization unsettled him more than the call itself. Elvis walked a window and pulled the curtain back slightly. The city lights shimmered, distant and indifferent. Somewhere out there was a small funeral home preparing a service for a man who had died believing Elvis Presley mattered enough to remember him. Elvis felt the weight of that belief settle on his shoulders. This wasn't charity. Charity made you feel lighter. This felt like responsibility, catching up. He poured himself a drink, but didn't touch it. Instead, he remembered a moment, years earlier, a brief interaction after a show. A man had waited near the back, not pushing, not shouting. Elvis had noticed him because he hadn't asked for anything. "You don't remember me," the man had said. Elvis had smiled politely. "I'm sorry." "That's okay," the man replied. "You smiled at me once. That was enough." At the time, Elvis had nodded and moved on. Now, sitting alone in the quiet, he wondered if that had been the same man. And if it was, how many others were out there carrying pieces of him he didn't even know he'd given away? The guilt wasn't loud. It was calm, persistent, heavy. Elvis realized then why he hadn't wanted his name on the funeral arrangements. Because this wasn't about being remembered as kind. It was about correcting something that felt unfinished. He picked up the phone again, hesitated, then set it back down. There was no one to call who would understand. And that, more than anything else, made the room feel unbearably small. By morning, Elvis had made a decision. Not the kind you announce. Not the kind you explain. The kind you carry quietly and never put into words. He called the funeral director again, voice steady, almost detached. "I don't want to know anything else about him," Elvis said. There was a pause on the other end. "Sir, no pictures, no details, no stories," Elvis continued. "Just make sure he's buried right." The director hesitated, then understood. "Yes, Mr. Presley." Elvis hung up and sat there for a long time, the phone still in his hand. It would have been easy to ask questions, to request a name, a face, a history, to turn the act into something personal enough to justify it. That was exactly why he didn't. If he let himself know the man, the weight would change shape. It would become grief. And grief demanded more than silence. Elvis stood and walked through the house slowly, noticing how many rooms felt too large when no one else was in them. Fame had given him space and taken away the comfort of being small enough to disappear inside it. Later that day, he drove alone. No bodyguards. No destination. Just a road stretching ahead, long and indifferent. At a red light, he caught his reflection in the rear-view mirror. For a brief moment, he didn't recognize himself, not the face, but the role. Singer, symbol, anchor for strangers. He thought about the man who had written his name down as a final point of contact, not because Elvis had offered help, but because his presence once had felt like enough. That terrified him. Elvis had spent years trying to be strong for everyone else. That night, he realized strength had consequences he'd never agreed to carry. When the light turned green, he drove on. He never attended the funeral, never sent flowers, never followed up. The money was transferred. The service happened. The man was buried. And Elvis kept none of the proof. Because sometimes, knowing less is the only way to survive what you've done for the right reasons. No one called Elvis afterward. No letter arrived. No acknowledgement. No quiet message passed through someone who knew someone. Exactly as he had asked. At first, that brought relief. The world stayed intact. His routine resumed. Rehearsals, meetings, flights. Life pressed forward with the same demands always had. And for a while, Elvis convinced himself the night had passed cleanly. A closed chapter, a resolved moment. But something subtle had shifted. He noticed it in the pauses, in the spaces between songs, when the band waited for his cue, and his mind drifted somewhere it didn't use to go. In the quiet before sleep, when the house settled and the noise he relied on to keep his thoughts moving finally gave way. There was no gratitude to absorb, no story to retell, no proof that what he'd done had mattered. And that was a problem. Elvis had spent his life giving things that came back to him. Applause, admiration, loyalty, love filtered through distance. Even generosity usually echoed. People thanked him, remembered him, attached his name to the kindness. This didn't. This kindness disappeared into ground with a man whose face he would never know. That realization unsettled him more than guilt ever had. One afternoon, Elvis sat alone in a rehearsal room long after the musicians had left. A guitar rested against the chair beside him, untouched. He stared at the floor, listening to the faint hum of electricity still running through the equipment. "Funny thing," he murmured to no one. "You don't miss the thank you until it never comes." He realized then how rarely he had done something with no audience at all, not even a private one. There was no version of the story where he was generous. No memory where he could reassure himself he'd done the right thing. Only a quiet certainty that something had been required of him, and he'd answered. That night, he dreamed a room with chairs arranged neatly, all facing forward. One chair in the front row was empty. When he woke, the feeling lingered. Not sadness, responsibility. Elvis understood then that the weight he carried wasn't fame, or money, or expectation. It was a realization that his presence, even fleeting, could alter someone's entire sense of worth. And that was not a gift you could ever fully accept. The question didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, disguising itself as curiosity before revealing what it really was. How many people had written his name down somewhere private? How many had carried a moment with him, like a personal possession? How many endings had his presence brushed against without him ever knowing? Elvis found himself watching people differently after that night. Not the crowds, the individuals. The man standing alone at the edge of a lobby. The woman who waited after show without pushing forward. The fan who didn't ask for anything at all. He noticed restraint now, and it unsettled him, because restraint meant expectation without demand. One evening, after performance, Elvis slipped away from the noise faster than usual. In his dressing room, he sat down heavily, costume still on, makeup half removed. The mirror reflected a version of him the audience never saw, tired eyes behind something carefully maintained. He thought again about the funeral, the quiet, the anonymity, the man lowered into the ground without a name spoken aloud. And he wondered how many times his face had become something symbolic to someone who needed stability more than admiration. Elvis pressed his palms against his knees, grounding himself. "I didn't ask for this," he whispered, not in anger, but in disbelief. Yet he also understood something uncomfortable. He hadn't refused it either. Fame had turned him into a landmark, a reference point, a final option. That realization reframed everything. His generosity, his distance, his need for control. He wasn't just protecting himself from exploitation. He was protecting himself from becoming someone's last hope again. Late that night, he wrote a note to himself and tore up immediately after. It said only one line: "You don't get to save everyone." He carried that truth forward, not as relief, but as survival. Because if he let himself believe otherwise, if he believed every stranger needed something from him, the weight would crush what little privacy he still had left. The night he paid for that funeral taught him something no applause ever had. Sometimes the heaviest connections are the ones you never see and never get to say goodbye to. Years passed. Shows blurred together. Cities changed. Faces came and went. But the night Elvis paid for a stranger's funeral never faded the way other memories did. It didn't return loudly. It didn't haunt him in flashes or dreams. It stayed with him quietly, like a rule he learned once and never forgot. There were moments later, many of them, when Elvis could have asked questions, when he could have leaned in, learned names, collected stories, when curiosity tried to disguise itself as compassion. Each time he stepped back, not because he didn't care, but because he finally understood the cost of caring without limits. Silence, he realized, had protected both of them. It protected the man from becoming a story told for sentiment. It protected Elvis from turning responsibility into identity. One night, long after the funeral, Elvis sat alone after a show, costume folded beside him, the room humming faintly with leftover energy. A fan letter lay open on the table. "You don't know me," it read, "but you saved me once just by being kind." Elvis folded the letter carefully and set it aside. He didn't feel proud. He felt careful, because he now knew something most people never had to face. That kindness could bind you to strangers in ways you never consented to and never fully escaped. The man whose funeral he paid for never thanked him, never acknowledged him, never even knew, for certain, who had stepped in. And that was exactly how it had to be. Elvis leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For once, he didn't imagine applause. He didn't imagine recognition. He imagined quiet dignity. A man laid to rest without debt, without spectacle, without anyone needing to explain why it mattered. That was the gift, not the money, not the act, the silence. Because in a world that never stopped taking pieces of him, that night was one of the few times Elvis Presley gave something away and kept himself whole.